Imagine standing on the rocky shores of the Tyrrhenian Sea, sometime around the middle of the 6th century before Christ. The sky is heavy with the scent of salt and smoke, while waves crash against the wooden hulls of dozens of triremes. The air is thick with tension. Oars creak, and every shout echoes across the water. This is not just another day at sea, it's the moment when two great worlds are about to collide. On one side, you have the Phoenicians, famous for their skills as sailors and traders, people who had crossed these waters for generations. Their purple-dyed cloth and faraway goods had made them legends across the Mediterranean. Alongside them stand their allies, the Etruscans, who ruled parts of what we now call Italy and were known for their strong, mysterious culture. Facing them are the Greeks, specifically colonists from a city called Phocaea. These Greeks were dreamers and adventurers, searching for new lands and opportunities beyond their crowded cities. They had settled on the island of Corsica, hoping to carve out a new life, but their presence was a direct challenge to the old powers that controlled these trade routes. Now picture the scene. The Greeks, outnumbered and far from home, form a tight circle with their ships, each sailor knowing that if the line breaks, there may be no escape. The Phoenicians and Etruscans, with more ships and resources, are determined to keep control over these seas. Both sides know what's at stake. Whoever wins will decide not just trade, but the fate of entire peoples. Here's an interesting fact. Historians believe that the tactics used in this battle were so innovative that they would influence naval warfare for centuries to come. For example, the Greeks invented a defensive formation on the water, something quite rare for their time. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians were famous for their speed and ability to outmaneuver almost any enemy. But this battle isn't just about ships and strategy. It's about real people. Sailors, leaders, families waiting for news that might never come. It's about fear and courage, ambition and survival. Every decision would have consequences, not just for those on the ships that day, but for the generations that followed. So before we dive deeper into this incredible story, just imagine yourself among those ancient sailors, facing the unknown, hoping to make it home. This is the Battle of Alalia, a moment when the course of history changed, shaped by the choices of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. Like this video, subscribe to Legacy of Empires, and activate the notification bell to join us on more historical journeys. Picture the Mediterranean in the 6th century before Christ as a massive chessboard where entire civilizations moved their pieces across the waves. The sea wasn't just water. It was the highway of the ancient world, where fortunes were made and empires were born. The Greeks had always been restless. They'd already spread their colonies across the eastern Mediterranean like seeds scattered by the wind. But now they were looking west with hungry eyes. Corsica, that rugged island sitting right in the middle of the western sea routes, must have looked like the perfect prize. Rich forests for shipbuilding, strategic harbors, and most importantly, control over the trade routes that connected Spain with Italy. But here's where things get interesting. The Phoenicians had been the undisputed masters of Mediterranean trade for centuries. These weren't just merchants, they were the most skilled sailors of their time, the ones who had figured out how to navigate by the stars when others still hugged coastlines. Their purple dye was worth more than gold, and their trading networks stretched from Spain to the Levant. Carthage, the greatest of all Phoenician cities, was like the New York of the ancient world. Imagine a bustling metropolis where ships from dozens of nations docked daily, where the air buzzed with a dozen languages, and where the smell of exotic spices mixed with the salt spray of the harbor. The Carthaginians had built their wealth on controlling sea routes, and suddenly these Greek colonists were threatening to cut right through their western territory. What made this situation even more explosive was the Etruscan factor. The Etruscans were the mysterious people who ruled much of central Italy before the Romans took over. They were skilled metalworkers, impressive builders, and they had their own reasons to fear Greek expansion. The Greeks settling in Corsica weren't just a threat to Phoenician trade, they were practically neighbors to Etruscan territory. So you had this perfect storm brewing. The Greeks, driven by their natural urge to explore and colonize, pushing into waters they'd never controlled before. The Phoenicians, watching their centuries-old trade empire being challenged by these newcomers, and the Etruscans, seeing Greek ships getting uncomfortably close to their own coastline. The fascinating thing is how this conflict shows us that even in ancient times, economics and politics were completely intertwined. This wasn't just about who controlled a single island. It was about who would dominate the entire Western Mediterranean. The winner would control the tin trade from Spain, the silver mines, the amber routes from the north, and the grain shipments that fed growing cities. The alliance between Carthage and the Etruscans was brilliant strategy. It was like two neighbors deciding to work together against a common threat. The Etruscans brought their knowledge of local waters and their skilled bronze-working technology, while the Carthaginians contributed their naval expertise and their network of allied cities. By the time the fleets finally met at Alalia, this wasn't just a battle, it was the climax of a collision between two completely different ways of life. The Greeks represented the new wave of colonization, the spirit of adventure and expansion that would eventually spread their culture across the known world. The Phoenicians and Etruscans represented the established order, the old guard fighting to protect what they'd built over generations. The stage was indeed set for war, but it was a war that would determine nothing less than the future of the Western Mediterranean. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of ancient history is how many heroes and villains have been swallowed by time itself. The Phoenician admirals who commanded at Alalia are perfect examples. Their names might be lost forever, but their legacy carved itself into the Mediterranean's very soul. These weren't your typical naval commanders. The Phoenicians had been perfecting the art of sea warfare for generations, passing down secrets from father to son like family heirlooms. Picture admirals who could read the wind's mood by the color of the waves, who knew exactly when to strike and when to retreat. They commanded ships that were marvels of engineering, sleek vessels built for speed and agility rather than brute force. What made these Phoenician warships so special was their design philosophy. While other civilizations were building floating fortresses, the Phoenicians created what you might call the sports cars of the ancient world. Their ships could turn on a dime, accelerate quickly, and dart in and out of enemy formations like deadly dancers. The bronze-reinforced rams on their prows weren't just weapons. They were precision instruments wielded by masters who understood that in naval combat, maneuverability often trumped size. The most fascinating thing about these unnamed admirals is what we can piece together about their mindset. They weren't fighting for glory or conquest in the traditional sense. They were defending a way of life that had made their people the wealthiest in the Mediterranean. Every decision they made at Alalia was calculated to preserve the trade networks that had taken centuries to build. On the other side of this epic confrontation stood the Phocian Greeks, and their story is equally compelling. Phocaea was a city on the coast of what we now call Turkey, and its people were known throughout the ancient world for their incredible seamanship and their almost reckless courage. When the Persian Empire started breathing down their necks in the mid-6th century before Christ, many Phocians made a choice that would define their destiny. They took to the sea. Imagine the scene. Entire families loading their most precious possessions onto ships, saying goodbye to the land their ancestors had called home for generations. But these weren't refugees in the traditional sense. The Phocians were explorers at heart, and they saw this forced migration as an opportunity to build something new and magnificent in the Western Mediterranean. The leader of these Greek colonists was a man whose vision extended far beyond simple survival. He looked at Corsica and saw not just a place to hide from the Persians, but a stepping stone to something greater. The Phocians had already established colonies in southern France and Spain, and Corsica would give them control over the sea routes connecting all their settlements. What made the Phocian Greeks so formidable was their combination of desperation and determination. They had literally burned their bridges. Some had even destroyed their old city rather than let it fall to the Persians. This wasn't just about finding a new home. It was about proving that Greek civilization could thrive anywhere brave men were willing to plant their flag. The Greek ships at Alalia were different from their Phoenician counterparts. Built more for endurance than speed, they reflected the Greek approach to warfare, disciplined, methodical, and designed to work as a unified force. The Greeks had pioneered the trireme, a warship with 3 banks of oars that could ram enemy vessels with devastating effect when properly coordinated. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this confrontation was the clash of naval philosophies. The Phoenicians fought like individual maestros, each captain making split-second decisions based on years of experience and intuition. The Greeks, on the other hand, fought like a symphony orchestra, each ship playing its part in a carefully orchestrated battle plan. As these two forces prepared to meet at Alalia, you have to wonder what went through the minds of these commanders. The Phoenician admirals knew they were fighting to preserve an empire built on trade and diplomacy. The Greek colonists understood they were fighting for the right to exist as a free people in a hostile world. Neither side could have imagined that their clash would echo through history, influencing how naval battles would be fought for centuries to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Tyrrhenian Sea as the two fleets came within sight of each other. You have to imagine the tension in that moment. Hundreds of ships spreading across the horizon like a deadly constellation, each crew knowing that many of them wouldn't see another sunset. The Greek commanders faced an impossible choice. They could see the combined Phoenician and Etruscan fleet stretching farther than their own forces, and they knew that traditional naval tactics would mean certain defeat. So they did something that had never been tried before in a major sea battle. They formed what they called a kyklos, a defensive circle with their ships arranged like the spokes of a wheel. This wasn't just clever tactics, it was born from desperation and genius working together. Picture 60 Greek ships arranged in a tight circle, their bronze-tipped rams pointing outward like the spines of a sea urchin. The strongest vessels formed the outer ring, while the damaged ships and those carrying the most precious cargo sheltered in the center. Every captain could see his neighbors, every crew could draw strength from the others. The beauty of this formation was that it eliminated the Phoenicians' greatest advantage, their superior maneuverability. No matter which direction the enemy attacked from, they'd face the same wall of bronze and iron. The Greeks had essentially turned their entire fleet into a floating fortress, and for a moment, it must have seemed like tactical brilliance. But the Phoenician and Etruscan admirals hadn't dominated Mediterranean waters for centuries without learning how to adapt. They studied the Greek formation like chess masters analyzing a new opening, and then they began to demonstrate why experience often trumps innovation. Instead of charging directly into the Greek spears, the Allied fleet began to circle the kyklos like wolves around a campfire. Their lighter, faster ships darted in and out, launching volleys of arrows and javelins before retreating beyond the reach of Greek counterattacks. It was exhausting warfare. The Greeks had to maintain their formation while constantly turning to face new threats from every direction. The real genius of the Phoenician strategy became clear as the battle wore on. They weren't trying to break the Greek circle all at once. Instead, they were stretching it, testing it, looking for the moment when fatigue and casualties would create a weakness they could exploit. Some of their ships would feint an attack from the north, while others prepared a real assault from the south. As the hours passed, the strain began to show. Greek rowers who had been pulling their oars in perfect rhythm started to falter. Ships that had maintained precise distances began to drift apart. The bronze rams that had seemed so menacing at dawn now felt heavy and unwieldy as exhausted crews struggled to keep them properly positioned. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the Greek ships, probably damaged by repeated arrow volleys, began to fall behind the others. It was like a single loose stone in a dam. Suddenly, there was a gap in the formation, and the Phoenicians pounced on it with the precision of surgeons. The breakthrough was swift and brutal. Phoenician ships poured through the opening like water through a broken dike, and suddenly the Greeks found themselves fighting on two fronts. The elegant defensive circle collapsed into chaos as individual ships found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. What followed was the kind of naval combat that haunted sailors' dreams for generations. Ships rammed each other with such force that the sound of splintering wood could be heard for miles. Crews who had trained together for years found themselves fighting hand-to-hand on blood-slicked decks as their vessels locked together in deadly embraces. The most tragic moments came when the wounded ships began to sink. A Greek warrior, weighed down by bronze armor that had been his protection on land, would find that same armor becoming his executioner in the water. These men had trained to fight on solid ground, where heavy equipment was an advantage. In the sea, it became a death sentence. You have to picture the horror of those final moments. Proud warriors who had conquered cities and defeated armies, now struggling helplessly as the weight of their own gear dragged them down into the dark water. Some tried to strip off their armor, but bronze corselets and greaves weren't designed for quick removal. Others managed to grab floating debris, only to lose their grip as exhaustion took hold. The Phoenician ships, built for speed and designed by people who understood the sea's moods, moved through the wreckage like predators. Their crews, many of whom had grown up on ships, pulled some Greek survivors from the water. But many more were left to the mercy of waves that showed no mercy at all. By the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the sea around Alalia had become a graveyard of ambitions. Broken masts jutted from the water like tombstones, and the waves carried the debris of dreams that had died with their dreamers. The Phoenicians had won not just a battle, but a war for the soul of the Western Mediterranean. The Greeks who survived would remember this day not as a glorious defeat, but as the moment when the sea itself seemed to turn against them. They had come to Corsica seeking a new beginning, but instead found an ending that would reshape the balance of power for generations to come. Sometimes the most powerful truths about ancient battles come not from the grand strategic accounts written by historians, but from the trembling hands of ordinary men who lived through hell and somehow found the strength to tell their stories. The Carthaginian sailors' words cut right to the heart of what this battle really meant. We fought not for glory, but survival. The Greeks were wolves at our doorstep. These weren't the words of a conquering hero boasting about his victories. This was a man who understood that everything his people had built over centuries was hanging by a thread. Think about what it meant to be Carthaginian in those days. Your grandfather might have sailed to distant Spain to trade for silver. Your father probably knew the exact winds needed to carry purple dye to Egypt. Your entire family's livelihood depended on those sea routes that had been safe for generations. Then suddenly, Greek ships appeared on the horizon, not as customers or partners, but as competitors who wanted to control the very waters that fed your children. This sailor's account reveals something profound about how the Phoenicians saw themselves. They weren't empire builders in the way we might imagine. They were merchants, traders, people who had grown wealthy by connecting different parts of the world. But now they found themselves forced to fight like warriors, and the weight of that responsibility must have been crushing. The Greek survivor's lament tells a completely different story, but one that's equally heartbreaking. The gods turned their backs. Alalia was our doom. Here was a man whose entire worldview had been shattered in a single afternoon. The Greeks had always believed that their gods favored the brave, that courage and skill would triumph over mere numbers. These Phocian Greeks had already shown incredible bravery by leaving their homeland rather than submit to Persian rule. They had crossed unknown seas, established new colonies, and built a life from nothing. They had every reason to believe that the gods smiled upon their courage, but at Alalia, all that faith came crashing down with their ships. What makes this survivor's account so powerful is how it captures the moment when confidence turns to despair. The Greeks had developed the Kyklos formation. They had positioned their best ships strategically. They had fought with the kind of disciplined courage that had made them famous throughout the Mediterranean. And yet, none of it mattered when the sea turned red with their blood. The fascinating thing about these personal accounts is how they reveal the human cost of what we now call geopolitics. Modern historians can analyze the Battle of Alalia as a clash between expanding Greek colonialism and established Phoenician trade networks. But for the men who fought there, it was much simpler and much more terrible. It was about watching your friends die and wondering if you'd live to see your family again. Consider the Carthaginian sailor's perspective during those final hours of battle. He would have seen Greek ships breaking apart under the bronze rams of his allies, heard the screams of drowning men, watched the water turn dark with blood and debris. But he also would have known that every Greek ship that sank meant his own children would grow up in a world where Carthaginian merchants could still sail safely. For the Greek survivor, the trauma went beyond physical pain. These were men who had already lost one homeland to the Persians. Corsica was supposed to be their second chance, their opportunity to build something lasting and beautiful. Losing at Alalia meant losing everything twice, and the psychological weight of that failure must have been unbearable. The religious dimension of the Greek account is particularly striking. Ancient Greeks didn't just worship their gods. They believed in a universe where divine favor could be earned through proper behavior and lost through hubris or cowardice. When this survivor said, "the gods turned their backs," he wasn't just describing a military defeat. He was trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. These personal testimonies also reveal something important about ancient naval warfare that often gets lost in tactical discussions. Fighting on ships wasn't like fighting on land, where you could retreat to higher ground or take cover behind shields. When your ship was sinking, you had nowhere to run. The sea didn't care about your courage or your cause. It would swallow heroes and cowards with equal indifference. The most haunting aspect of these accounts is how they capture the moment when individual human dreams collided with the vast forces of history. The Carthaginian sailor probably never imagined he'd have to fight for his life against Greek colonists. The Greek survivor almost certainly never expected that his quest for a new homeland would end in such catastrophic defeat. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these voices from the deep is that they survived at all. In an age when most people couldn't read or write, when papyrus was expensive and stone tablets were reserved for the most important messages, someone thought these personal stories were worth preserving. They remind us that behind every great historical event were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, doing their best to survive and make sense of a world that seemed determined to destroy them. What would you have done in the face of such a battle? Drop your thoughts below, like this video, and share it with fellow history lovers. Don't forget to subscribe to Legacy of Empires. The morning after Alalia, the Mediterranean had become a different world. The Greek ships that had once dotted Corsican harbors like white birds were gone, leaving behind only empty moorings and the bitter taste of defeat. But sometimes in history, the most important consequences of a battle aren't the ones that happen immediately. They're the ones that unfold over generations, like ripples spreading across still water. The Greek evacuation of Corsica wasn't just a military withdrawal, it was the collapse of a dream. Picture the scene. Families who had already fled their homeland once before now faced the heartbreaking task of packing up their lives again. Children who had grown up thinking of Corsica as home suddenly found themselves refugees once more, sailing toward an uncertain future with nothing but the clothes on their backs and memories of two lost homelands. These weren't just any Greeks, they were Phocaeans, people who had already proven their resilience by surviving the Persian conquest of their original city. But even the strongest spirits can break, and many of these survivors chose to scatter across the Western Mediterranean rather than try to rebuild as a unified community. Some sailed to their existing colonies in southern France, others joined Greek settlements in Spain, and a few even made their way back east toward more established Greek territories. The most tragic part of this exodus was how it represented the death of Greek ambitions in the Western Mediterranean. For decades, Greek colonists had been pushing westward, establishing trading posts and cities from Sicily to the coasts of modern-day France and Spain. Corsica was supposed to be the crown jewel of this expansion, the strategic base that would let them control the sea routes between all their western settlements. Its loss meant that the Greeks would never again be a major power in the Western Sea. But while the Greeks licked their wounds and scattered to the winds, the victors faced the pleasant problem of dividing up the spoils. The alliance between Carthage and the Etruscans had worked perfectly, but now they had to figure out how to share the rewards without destroying the partnership that had made victory possible. The Etruscans, being closer to Corsica and having contributed significantly to the naval campaign, claimed the right to directly control the island. This made perfect sense from their perspective. Corsica would serve as a buffer zone protecting their mainland territories from future Greek expansion. They moved quickly to establish settlements and fortifications, turning the island into what was essentially an Etruscan military outpost. Carthage, meanwhile, claimed something even more valuable than territory. They secured exclusive trading rights throughout the Western Mediterranean. The Carthaginians were always more interested in commerce than conquest, and this arrangement gave them exactly what they wanted: guaranteed access to the profitable trade routes that connected Spain's silver mines with the markets of Italy and North Africa. What made this division of spoils so successful was how it played to each civilization's strengths. The Etruscans got the strategic military position they needed to protect their homeland, while the Carthaginians got the commercial dominance they craved. It was a partnership that would define the balance of power in the Western Mediterranean for the next century. But here's where the story takes an ironic turn. The very success of this Carthaginian-Etruscan alliance created the conditions for future conflicts that would be far more devastating than anything seen at Alalia. While these two powers were congratulating themselves on their victory, a small city on the Italian peninsula was watching and learning from their example. Rome, in 540 before Christ, was still a relatively minor power, more concerned with local Italian politics than Mediterranean-wide strategy. But the Romans had a gift for learning from other people's successes and failures, and they were paying very close attention to what had happened at Alalia. The Roman leadership recognized something that the victors themselves might have missed. The battle had proven that naval power was becoming the key to controlling the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled the sea routes would control the wealth and therefore the destiny of the ancient world. This lesson would shape Roman thinking for generations to come. Even more importantly, the Romans observed how the Carthaginian-Etruscan alliance had worked. They saw how two different civilizations with complementary strengths could combine their resources to defeat a common enemy. This wasn't just a tactical observation, it was a strategic insight that would influence Roman diplomacy for centuries. The Etruscans, flush with their victory and now controlling both Corsica and much of central Italy, probably seemed like permanent fixtures in the Mediterranean power structure. But the Romans were already beginning to see their northern neighbors as potential rivals rather than permanent allies. The same Etruscan success that had crushed the Greeks at Alalia would eventually make them a target for Roman expansion. As for Carthage, their newfound dominance over Western Mediterranean trade routes made them incredibly wealthy and powerful. Carthaginian merchants could now sail from Spain to Italy without fear of Greek pirates or competitors. Their purple-dyed textiles, exotic spices, and skilled craftwork flowed freely across the sea, generating profits that would fund the greatest navy the ancient world had ever seen. But wealth and power have a way of breeding enemies, and the Romans were already beginning to recognize that Carthage's commercial empire represented a fundamental threat to their own ambitions. The same trade routes that made Carthage rich would eventually become the battleground for a series of conflicts that would determine the fate of the entire Mediterranean world. The most fascinating aspect of Alalia's aftermath is how it demonstrates the law of unintended consequences in action. The Carthaginians and Etruscans had fought to preserve their existing way of life, but their victory ended up creating a new balance of power that would prove inherently unstable. By eliminating the Greek threat, they had cleared the way for an even more dangerous rival to emerge. Within a few generations, the Romans would be challenging Etruscan dominance in central Italy. Within a few centuries, they would be fighting the Carthaginians for control of the very trade routes that had been secured at Alalia. The victory that had seemed so complete in 540 before Christ would ultimately prove to be just the opening move in a much larger game. The sea had indeed been rewritten at Alalia, but the new text would prove to be written in disappearing ink. History has a strange sense of humor. The same battle that seemed to secure Phoenician dominance forever would eventually be remembered as the moment when the forces that would destroy them first began to stir. Alalia wasn't just a naval clash, it was a turning point disguised as an ending, a victory that carried within it the DNA of future defeat. The Phoenicians, sailing home from Corsica in 540, before Christ couldn't have imagined that they had just won the last great naval victory their civilization would ever achieve. They had crushed the Greek threat, secured their trade routes, and proven that Carthage was the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Their purple sails caught the wind with the confidence of a people who believed they had solved the puzzle of Mediterranean power forever. But empires, like people, often carry the seeds of their own destruction within their greatest triumphs. The Phoenicians had always been traders first and warriors second, and their victory at Alalia reinforced this fundamental aspect of their character. They returned to what they did best, building commercial networks, establishing trading posts, and accumulating wealth through peaceful exchange rather than conquest. This approach had made them incredibly successful for centuries, but it also made them vulnerable in ways they couldn't see. While Carthaginian merchants were counting their profits and expanding their trade routes, their enemies were learning the lessons of Alalia and preparing for a very different kind of war. The Greeks, scattered and seemingly defeated, refused to accept their exile as permanent. Those Phocian survivors who had fled Corsica carried with them not just the bitterness of defeat, but also invaluable knowledge about Phoenician naval tactics and strategy. They had seen how the Carthaginians fought, studied their ship designs, and learned from their own mistakes. Within a generation, Greek naval technology began to evolve in fascinating ways. The disaster at Alalia had taught them that their traditional heavy ships and rigid formations were no match for Phoenician mobility and tactical flexibility. So they began building faster vessels, training their crews in new maneuvers, and developing strategies that would turn Phoenician advantages against them. The most remarkable example of this Greek resilience came about 70 years after Alalia, when a much larger Persian fleet threatened to destroy Greek civilization entirely. At the Battle of Salamis, the Greeks used tactics that seemed to echo the lessons learned in defeat at Corsica. They lured the Persian ships into confined waters, where numbers meant less than skill, and they coordinated their attacks with a precision that would have been impossible without the hard-won experience of earlier defeats. When the Persian fleet was annihilated at Salamis, it wasn't just a victory over the Persians. It was proof that the Greeks had learned from their failures and emerged stronger. The civilization that had seemed broken after Alalia had reinvented itself as a naval power capable of defeating the largest empire the world had ever seen. But the most profound legacy of Alalia wasn't what it taught the Greeks. It was what it taught the Romans. Those Italian observers who had watched the battle from a distance drew conclusions that would reshape the entire Mediterranean world. They saw how naval power had become the key to controlling trade, how alliances could multiply military strength, and how even the most dominant civilizations could be challenged by determined enemies. The Romans were natural students of power, and they absorbed every lesson Alalia had to offer. They began building their own navy, not immediately, but gradually and systematically. They studied Phoenician ship design, recruited Greek naval experts, and most importantly, they began to think about the Mediterranean as a single integrated system rather than a collection of separate seas. This Roman approach would prove revolutionary. While the Phoenicians saw the Mediterranean as a highway for trade, and the Greeks viewed it as a series of separate colonial opportunities, the Romans began to envision it as a single lake that could be controlled from a single center. This vision would drive their expansion for centuries and ultimately lead to the very conflicts that would destroy their rivals. The irony of Carthage's situation became clear over time. Their victory at Alalia had given them exactly what they thought they wanted: control over the Western Mediterranean trade routes. But this success made them incredibly wealthy, and wealth made them a target. The same trade networks that generated Carthaginian prosperity would eventually become the prize that Rome was determined to claim. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage that would eventually burn the Mediterranean wasn't really about ideology or culture. It was about the fundamental question of who would control the economic heart of the ancient world. The trade routes that the Phoenicians had fought to protect at Alalia became the battleground for the Punic Wars, conflicts so devastating that they would literally reshape the map of the Mediterranean. What makes the legacy of Alalia so fascinating is how it demonstrates that in history, there are no permanent victories. The Phoenicians had defeated the Greeks, but they had also revealed their own strategies and capabilities to observers who would use that knowledge against them. They had secured their trade routes, but they had also shown how valuable those routes were to anyone ambitious enough to take them. The Greeks, seemingly crushed at Alalia, would go on to create the cultural and intellectual foundations of Western civilization. Their defeat in the Western Mediterranean freed them to focus on their eastern territories, where they would build city-states that would produce philosophy, drama, mathematics, and political theory that still influence us today. The Etruscans, the forgotten partners in the Alalia victory, would discover that success could be just as dangerous as failure. Their control of Corsica and their alliance with Carthage made them wealthy and powerful, but it also made them the primary obstacle to Roman expansion in central Italy. Within a few centuries, Etruscan civilization would be absorbed completely into the Roman system, leaving behind only mysterious tombs and undeciphered inscriptions. And Rome, the distant observer of Alalia, would eventually become the inheritor of everything the battle had decided. They would conquer the Etruscan territories, destroy the Carthaginian trade empire, and even absorb the scattered Greek colonies into their own system. The Mediterranean that had been divided between multiple powers after Alalia would eventually become Mare Nostrum, our sea, under Roman control. The most profound lesson of Alalia's legacy is that no empire rules forever, not because they are defeated in battle, but because victory itself changes the world in ways that make old forms of power obsolete. The Phoenicians won the day, but they had also won their way into a new era where their particular combination of commercial skill and naval power would no longer be enough to guarantee survival. The ripples from that ancient battle would continue to spread across the Mediterranean for centuries, each wave creating new possibilities and destroying old certainties, until finally the sea itself would be inherited by people who had learned from everyone else's victories and defeats. When we look back at the Battle of Alalia today, it's easy to see it as just another ancient naval clash. Ships ramming ships, warriors drowning in bronze armor, empires rising and falling like waves on a beach. But the truth is far more profound and haunting than that. This wasn't just a fight over trade routes or territorial control. It was a moment when the entire future of Western civilization hung in the balance, decided by men whose names we'll never know, fighting for reasons that seemed crystal clear to them, but are now lost in the mists of time. The most striking thing about Alalia is how it forces us to confront one of history's most uncomfortable truths. The people who shape the world are often not the ones who get remembered for it. We know the names of Caesar and Alexander, of Hannibal and Pericles, but the Phoenician admirals who commanded at Alalia have been swallowed by time as completely as their enemies were swallowed by the sea. Think about what that means. These were men who had spent their entire lives mastering the art of naval warfare. They had studied wind patterns and tidal flows, learned to read the moods of the sea like a farmer reads the sky. They had trained crews who could row in perfect synchronization and fight with the kind of disciplined courage that only comes from absolute trust in your shipmates. And yet, for all their skill and sacrifice, they exist for us now only as shadows, their victories reduced to a few lines in ancient texts. This is what makes the phrase, "history is written by the victors," so much more complex than it first appears. Yes, the Phoenicians won at Alalia, and yes, their version of events is the one that has come down to us. But even the victor's story is incomplete, filtered through centuries of copying and recopying, translated from languages that died with the civilizations that spoke them. The Phoenicians may have written the first draft of Alalia's story, but time itself has been editing it ever since. The Greek survivors who escaped that watery graveyard carried with them not just the bitterness of defeat, but also the seeds of future victories. Their children would grow up hearing stories of that terrible day, learning from their father's mistakes, preparing for the moment when they could reclaim their honor on the waves. And when that moment came, at places like Salamis and Plataea, they would prove that even the most crushing defeats can become the foundation for eventual triumph. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Alalia's legacy is how it reminds us that the sea truly does remember what the land forgets. Archaeologists have never found the wreckage of those ancient ships, but every now and then, fishermen working the waters around Corsica bring up pieces of bronze or pottery that might have come from that long-ago battle. The Mediterranean itself has become a vast underwater museum, preserving fragments of that ancient tragedy in ways that no human archive ever could. The waters around Alalia have witnessed so much history since that day in 540 before Christ. Roman galleys have crossed those same currents, carrying legions to conquer new territories. Medieval merchants have sailed those routes, spreading ideas and technologies across the known world. Modern naval battles have been fought in waters that still hold the bones of Phoenician and Greek warriors, yet something about Alalia feels different from all these later conflicts. Maybe it's because it was fought at a time when the Mediterranean was truly the center of the world, when controlling its trade routes meant controlling the fate of entire civilizations. Or maybe it's because the stakes were so personal, not abstract concepts like nationalism or ideology, but the simple human desire to build a home and protect your family. The Phoenicians who fought at Alalia weren't trying to conquer the world. They were trying to preserve a way of life that had made their people prosperous and peaceful for centuries. The Greeks weren't seeking to destroy an empire. They were looking for a place where they could rebuild after losing everything to the Persians. The tragedy of Alalia is that both sides were fighting for essentially the same thing: the right to exist safely in a dangerous world. This is why the battle continues to echo through time. Every generation that faces the choice between accommodation and resistance, between preserving the old ways and embracing change, is essentially refighting the Battle of Alalia. The specific technologies change, the weapons become more sophisticated, but the fundamental human dilemmas remain the same. The sea around Corsica today is a peaceful place, popular with tourists who come to swim in its clear blue waters and sail along its scenic coastline. But if you know the history, if you understand what happened there more than 2,000 years ago, you can almost hear the echoes of that ancient battle in the sound of waves breaking against the shore. Those waves have been breaking in the same rhythm for millennia, carrying away the debris of human ambition, smoothing the sharp edges of ancient conflicts until they become just another layer in the great geological record of the Mediterranean. The sea remembers, but it remembers differently than we do. It remembers the weight of bronze armor sinking into darkness, the taste of blood mixing with salt water, the silence that falls when the last scream fades into the wind. The sailors who fought at Alalia believed they were fighting for something permanent, something that would last forever. The Phoenicians thought they were securing their trade routes for all time. The Greeks believed they were carving out a new homeland that would endure for generations. Neither side could have imagined that their great battle would eventually be remembered mainly as a footnote in the rise of Rome, or that the civilizations they died to protect would someday exist only in museums and history books. But that's the thing about echoes. They don't preserve the original sound perfectly. They transform it, distort it, sometimes make it more beautiful than it was when it was first created. The echo of Alalia that reaches us today isn't just the story of a naval battle. It's a reminder that every human conflict, no matter how small or forgotten, is part of a larger pattern that stretches back to the beginning of recorded history and forward to futures we can't yet imagine. The sea remembers what the land forgets, and perhaps that's as it should be. The land changes, is built upon, is conquered and reconquered until the original inhabitants are just names in old books. But the sea remains, carrying within its depths the secrets of every civilization that ever dared to cross its surface. Until next time, fair winds and following seas. And remember that every wave that breaks on every shore is carrying messages from the past that only the sea itself can fully understand. If this story resonated with you, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more tales from the annals of history.